Hi, my name is Sean Olson. In this video I'm going to show you some of the similarities and some of the differences between Hammer on the left and 3ds Max on the right. Many of the people that I work with have a background in using Hammer and sometimes struggle with moving into a more complex program like 3ds Max. I'm going to give you a brief tour of some of the similarities between the two and how to accomplish some of the same kind of tasks. I have them both scrunched to fit into the same view, but we have Hammer here with the basic default setup with the 4 views, and we have our tools out here. And on the right we have the same thing with 3ds Max, the basic views and some of the basic tools. First up, we're going to talk about creating objects. In Hammer, to create an object, you'll want to have the object tools open here. And you can see that we have the block object. And if you have this menu here, you drop down, you're going to see different types of primitives, basically. And we have arch, block, cylinder, sphere, spike, torus, and wedge. If we wanted to create an object in Hammer, we would draw it out in one of the orthographic views and hit enter, and then it would appear in our scene. And then if we wanted to select it and move it around, we can move it in the viewport here or resize it. To do the same thing in Max, we go over here to what's called the command panel. Over here on the right, this is the command panel. It has a bunch of different tabs here. The first tab is the create tab. In this, it defaults to geometry, because in 3ds Max, unlike Hammer, we can make more than just objects. We can make shapes, lights. Actually, in Hammer, we can also make lights. We have shapes, lights, cameras, and other kinds of helpers that are used for all kinds of different tasks. For anything that involves creating just brushes, for the most part, you're just going to stay in the geometry. See, if we hover over it, it's going to say geometry. And notice there's a drop down here that says standard primitives. This is similar to you being in the block tool and seeing that we have a category called primitives. Here we have standard primitives. And then underneath that, over on Hammer here, see we had the different specific primitives. Same thing over here, we have different types of standard primitives. So the equivalent to the block in Hammer is the box. So if I click on box, I am now in create mode of making boxes. So you see that this is highlighted with blue. That means that I'm in that object and I'm in create mode. So that means I can just create boxes. Now there's a difference between Max and Hammer with creating things. In Hammer you draw out the bounding of the object and then have to hit enter to actually create it. In Max you're actually click and you're starting the creation process. And most primitives have a process where the first click does one function and then you click and drag and you'll go and set a dimension or other parameter in the creation process. So right now I'm creating the base dimensions of this box. When I let go of the mouse, I now can slide up and I'm now making the height. So it's a live view of this object. And as soon as I click again, I've now finished creating this box. And I'm still in create mode, however. So I'm still in the mode, as you can see highlighted box here, to create more boxes. So if I wanted to, I can just keep on going out here and making these boxes however I want. So that's one thing to remember, is that I'm constantly being able to create until I get out of create mode. And that would happen when I right click. So as soon as I right click, you'll see that box is no longer highlighted, and now I'm not creating. In fact, I'm selecting. The next thing we're going to discuss here, let's go back in Hammer and make a couple more boxes here. The next thing we're going to discuss is selecting objects that you've already created. In Hammer, you click the select tool, the selection tool. Click that and now we can select the different objects in the scene. If I want to select multiple objects, I highlight them in a view and hit enter, and now I've selected multiple ones. In 3ds Max, the select tool, which is currently highlighted right here, I can get to also by clicking Q on the keyboard. If I click that, I can just select an object. Now currently, my computer's not set up right now to display something you would normally see, but normally you would see it highlighted like this. If I hold down Control, I can select multiple objects, keep adding to my current selection here. And if I hit Alt, I can deselect something when I click on it. So Control adds, Alt removes. Now when you're in selection mode, there's different types of selection regions. We're currently in the rectangle selection mode. So what that means is, because previously I was just clicking on individual objects, but I can also select and drag in the viewport. So unlike Hammer where you select and then hit Enter, over in Max you just select and let go and it will select those. And again, I can also hit Control to add to things, and I can hit Alt to subtract even with the selection marquee. So if you hold down this, in fact in many of these menu items, if you see a little tiny triangle at the corner of the button, that means that there's a flyout and you can have more options. So I'm going to hold this down and we're going to see different types of selection areas that we can choose from. And for example, here's the circle one, which I actually rarely use this version, but you select by a circle. There is this fence selection, which you click and hold down, you'll start creating linear lines, but you're drawing a polygon in order to select. You can see that the lines are always linear for drawing. And this is good for certain scenarios. There's also a freehand selection or a lasso selection, and in this kind you can select, you can just draw the selection. You can select all of these this way, and again there's Alt selecting to remove objects from the selection. So these are kind of important things to understand of the different ways to select things, and the next one is the spray selection. And what this does is it allows you to basically select by anything that touches the circle as you click and drag. So if there's many objects, you just click and drag, and as the selection area goes over the object, it will select it. And I Alt selected that one to deselect again. We hit Q or clicked on this Select Object button in order to select things. There's also some select and transform buttons. For example, select and move, select and rotate, and select and scale. There's also a select and place. These buttons are similar to the selection. However, as soon as you've clicked on something, you can now move it or rotate it. So if I want to move this object, I'm now moving it around because I am in the select and move. Likewise, if I want to rotate it, I click the rotation button and select it and rotate. And right now it's on free rotation. I'm not limiting by angles, which we'll discuss that here shortly. One thing to note, I'm going to undo that, is it's a good habit to use the Q button if you're just wanting to select stuff. I'm going to click Q and pick it. And you'll notice that the gizmo here doesn't have any of the big move. The gizmo is only showing the axes, but it doesn't prompt you for moving and rotating, etc. The reason you should do this for when you just need to pick something is that oftentimes it's easy to accidentally move something when you didn't mean to if you use the select and move. So in this case, if I go and just select this object right now and I'm not paying attention, I may move it right away. It's a good habit to always click Q when you just need to select things and not use the select and move. Now there are shortcuts for all of these. The Q for selection, and then W, which would go to transform, E, which goes to rotation, and R for scale. Now scaling, and let's go over here and go into Hammer and talk about this for a second. In Hammer, you scale by selecting something and just dragging some of the handles, like say up or out like this. And that's fine. You can do that in Hammer, and you can do the same thing in Max generally, but there are some caveats. Generally speaking, it's not good practice to select an object and just start scaling it. Now that may seem weird at first if you're not used to 3ds Max, but you should avoid using scale in many circumstances until you understand some of the problems that can happen, especially if you're going to get into rigging and animating. And we're not going to cover that, but I'm going to show you why it's not always completely necessary. In the case of a box here, I can actually just go back to the Modify tab when I have it selected. And this is the next thing to learn about Max. We were on the Create tab to create things. But if you go to the Modify tab when something is selected, you're going to see its parameters. Anything that we can control for this. So in this case, if I need this to be taller, I can actually go back in here, and I'm not changing its scale. I'm just changing its height parameter. In this case, I'm going to type in 512, and there's its specific value. Now, what parameters will actually be available over here are dependent on what kind of object we have selected. In this case, we have a box. So let's compare a few of these other primitives over here. Let's go back into Hammer and go to our objects here. So we have another one would be cylinder. So if I create a cylinder here, hit enter, we have our cylinder. Now, one difference between Max and Hammer is again that now that this is made, the only parameters we have really are the dimensions and where the vertices are at, and we can go and move these vertices directly. Same with our cylinder. We can size it here, but we can't control, say, the number of sides on this one. We'd have to recreate it. We're going to go over here and go back to our Create tab, and in the Geometry section, we're going to choose under Standard Primitives, Cylinder. So now let's add a cylinder out here. Now once I've created it, I can go to the Modify tab, and I'm going to see all of these parameters, including the radius, the height, and some other parameters, including the number of sides. So this helps us if we need to change the resolution of it to fit our needs after we've already made it. And there's another thing on here called height segments, and this is going to be an important thing for our level design purposes, especially when we're making brushes. We need to get rid of these height segments. So you'll see as I bring this down, we get rid of all of those. And that's because brushes can have no coplanar polygons. We need all the polygons to be one polygon per plane on our object. So now we have this cylinder here, and we can move it around wherever we want to go, just like we can in Hammer. Now I've been using this perspective view. I could also use these top views, or the front, top, and left view, just like in Hammer. And that's going to be something we're going to discuss here, is some of the differences between these different views and some of the tools that relate to those that are kind of important. In Hammer, when you move something around, it's automatically going to be in the 2D dimension when you're doing from orthographic. So it will stay in that plane where it's already at and only move in the other two axes. 3ds Max is a little bit more complex with that. So if we go into our front view and we're moving this around, we're going to find that we can potentially have issues if we're using snaps. Fortunately, Wallworm has something installed that automatically switches between the different views. So if you look up here in the main toolbar, there's this snaps toggle. If I hold it down, you see it says 2, 2.5, and 3. If you don't have Wallworm installed, it's very important to remember if you're in these orthographic projections like top, front, left, that you should always have this set to 2.5 or 2 and not 3. Likewise, if you're in the perspective view, this should always be set to 3. Now you're going to notice here as I select different viewports, as I select these different viewports with the middle mouse button, you're going to see that this number on this button is changing. That's because Wallworm is changing it for you automatically. So this is only going to do that if you have Wallworm installed. If you don't have Wallworm installed, you're going to have to do this yourself. Now this button itself is for turning on or off snaps, and these are just the different modes, 2, 2.5, and 3. When you're in the 3D view, it should always be 3, and it's for snapping purposes to let you snap on objects in 3 dimensions. And if you're in 2D views, it's for snapping on objects in 2 dimensions, in 2.5. So I'm not going to go into explaining that very much. There are some videos that are already out there that Autodesk has put out, and I will link to those. And those are very important to understand what modes those are and what's going on. Understanding those will be very helpful in effectively navigating the viewport. But for now, I'm going to actually just be in perspective view, and to make things easier to see, I'm going to maximize it. So to do that, down here at the bottom right, you're going to see this icon here. This says maximize viewport toggle. Also, it shows you the shortcut Alt-W. Whichever viewport is currently the highlighted viewport, which is right here designated by the yellow outline, if I hit Alt-W, it's going to maximize. So I like to work in just this perspective viewport. Some people like to keep out the multiple viewports. That's your own preference. So now we've discussed how to create different primitives here. We can create others, including a sphere. If we create this and hit enter, there's our sphere. And in Max, we can do the same thing. We can create our sphere. And by default, this is pretty high resolution for a brush. So we can bring this down or up depending on your needs. So one thing you'll notice that right now is that when we create an object over here in Hammer, it automatically had a material applied to it. All of these are getting whatever is currently the selected material over here. We can do the same thing in Max if you have Wallworm installed, and this is going to bring us to the material editor. Unlike Hammer, which does have a material browser and lets you apply materials to objects, in 3ds Max you can actually create materials from scratch. So we're going to bring out this material editor here, or the material browser in Hammer. And then in my main toolbar here, I'm going to slide over here and click this icon for the material editor. It's going to bring up this material editor. Now by default, 3ds Max doesn't really have materials that are set up for the game. You have to create those or import those. Unlike in Hammer, when you open it up, you're going to have access to all the materials that you just already had available in the game you're working with. Now there are ways to bring in materials from the game into Max, and I'm not really going to discuss all of those, but if you want to get to those, I will link to those. So right now we're going to discuss creating a material from scratch. And the material browser's in here. So you'll see over here that I have some tabs in here. These are slate views, because this is called the slate material editor. Each view is just a way to organize your materials you're working with. And by default, you're actually just going to see one labeled view 1. I have my Max set up so that it defaults to having 3 views already made with these names. So I can right click on a view on an empty spot, and you'll see that I have these options to create things in here. And under materials, under scan line, you'll see one called standard. The standard material is probably the material you should use most when working with Max and making materials for going into source. Once we do that, it will create a material here. Alternatively, you can see over here on the material browser, it has materials. There's also scan line, and you're going to see standard right here. I could also have clicked and dragged it out here. Any of the things that are over here, you can click and drag out. A material can be applied to an object in many ways. One way is to double click it and make sure it's selected. So once it's selected, you'll see its parameters over here in the actual material editor. We can click on its output node and drag it onto an object in the scene. Alternatively, if we have objects, I was in create mode still. If we have objects selected in the scene and I double click a material, I can hit this button over here that says assign material to selection. So if I click that, the currently selected objects are going to get those materials. So this is to create materials and add them to objects that are already created. If I want to go and change the setting of this material, I can change any of the parameters over here in the parameter editor by clicking on them and changing their values. Double click another material and you see the dotted line around it. That designates this as the currently selected one. Change its parameters and they will be updated in the viewport. So now we've created some materials and we've added them to objects. But how do we create new objects that automatically get a material? Well, that's simple. If you have Wallworm installed, I'm going to go to I'm going to maximize the max in the viewport. I'm going to maximize max in the viewport so we can see the menus here. If I click Wallworm and go to level design and choose brush mode, I will now automatically get the material applied when I create a new object. Whatever material is currently selected with this highlighted here and available in this will now get that material. So as I make new ones, if I select this material, double click it, now that's the material being applied to new objects. So this is when you're in brush mode. If I go and turn off brush mode, see this check mark here, means it's on. If I undo that and create a new box, you're going to see that it's getting no material and just getting the wire colors randomly. So I'm going to hit M to toggle off my material editor for the moment, and we're going to discuss some other things. So let's bring Max over to the side again so that we can have Hammer and Max side by side. I'm going to close this material editor for now, and we'll discuss materials in more depth later. So now we're going to discuss some of the other things in here and the snaps and viewing and hiding things. So as you can see in Hammer, we by default have a bunch of our tools just automatically out here. In fact, if we go to view, we have screen elements and most of these are already out here. I'm going to turn on manifest bar just to show you, and I'm not going to use it here, but that's to bring it out, and we're going to turn that back off. And the reason I'm showing you that is there's similar things inside of Max, and let's maximize this again just for the moment. If you right click on this little dotted lines here, or if you go to an empty spot on your main toolbar up here and right click, you're going to see that it's going to show you with check marks a bunch of your tools that are already out. For example, the command panel, which is over here. If I turn that off, you see that the command panel is gone. If I right click, I'm going to bring back in the command panel again. Same with the main toolbars. Now if I right click up here, I can get the same option. We want to bring in the main toolbar again. There's several that are not checked, and some of these that are checked that are not in the view because I have them on my other monitor. So ones that you should probably end up checking automatically are snaps and layers. Now snaps are very important, and I'm not going to discuss them in extreme detail, but they relate to this 3D snap toggle that we discussed earlier and are very important for snapping things and putting things exactly where you want. Right now I'm snapping to both the grid and to vertices, and what that means is you see the yellow that's appearing here, you see it highlights that I'm automatically snapping to that vertex of that object right here. See? So that means I can actually create a box that just is snapping to the top of that box, and its height is exactly to the height of that because I use the snapping, so I'm snapping to specific points. So if I want to snap from here to here and go down in there to fill that up, you can see I use those snap to vertex, and I have snap to grid on. Sometimes it's good to use just one of these, sometimes it's good to use both. Now If you find that there's no snapping going on, it's because you look up at this main toolbar button for the snaps toggle, you may see that it's off. So when it's like this, you're going to see that I'm no longer seeing any snap preview. And as I make things, I'm no longer snapping to the grid at all. And this is really not very good when you're making your brushes. So it's very important to remember to keep your snaps on. You can click this button, or as you see, it shows you the shortcut there, S. S is the shortcut for turning on snaps, turning it on and off. So if I turn this back on, I'm now snapping. Now you can see that I have the grid showing here, and this is called the home grid. And that's important because we can make multiple grids. And you're also going to see that right now at the bottom down here, you're going to see that it says that grid is 64. That's telling you what the current grid spacing is. You can click G to toggle grids on and off. And you can also resize them. Now, in Hammer, we can change the grid a couple ways. We can either use these plus or minus icons. So if we click these, you're going to see that the grid spacing increases. And you can also use the bracket keys, left bracket and right bracket. You can do the same thing inside of Max, however, you'll have to set something up. So first of all, if I right-click the 3D Snaps toggle, I bring up the grid snap settings. If I go to Home Grid, I can change the grid spacing here, and that will be the spacing. However, it's better to set up some keyboard shortcuts, because by default there is no shortcut for doubling and having the grid sides. So if you have Wallworm installed, I'm going to maximize Max again, and you go to customize user interface and go to keyboard, this is the place where you can go to customize all of your keyboard shortcuts and your menus and toolbars and make up your own customization to have Max do all the things that you specifically want. What you want to do for this specific thing is to change the category to wallworm.com, and you're going to find in here that there's an option for decrease grid spacing. And I've already set mine to the left bracket, but you can set an hotkey for it over here, and there's also an increase grid spacing. This will replicate what we had in Hammer. So now if I hit those, you're going to see that the grid doubles or gets half in size. So the next thing we're going to compare between the two is viz groups and layers. In Hammer they're called viz groups, in Max they're called layers. So viz groups allow you to group objects in ways that are logical and let you show and hide them and manage what you're looking at in your scene more easily. So in this case, I'm going to select these three objects here and add them to a new viz group. I'm going to click this button here, and I'm going to give this the name test. All right. So now I can toggle those objects on and off. They're still individual objects, but they're in a viz group called test. And now I can select these objects and put them in another viz group. I'm going to call this round. So these are objects that are round. So now I have these listed here as test and round. So I can hide them and unhide them as I need to, because I may not need to be seeing them all depending on what I'm doing. And there's a lot of good reasons you'd want to do this. And there's also automatically generated viz groups inside of Hammer. Let's go over to 3ds Max. And earlier I had brought out the layers option here. This is a toolbar, I mean. And what it will show you is the current default layer. So there's always a default layer. I'm going to bring this out here so we can see it all in my viewport. So every time we make a new object, it's going to go in that layer. In fact, you're going to see there's a whole bunch of layers here that I have my version of Max set up to automatically create a bunch of different layers to work with. By default, when you start Max, you're actually just going to see 0 default. That's the only one there. If I choose to put new things, I'm going to create this one called brush layout, and it's the current active layer. So now as I make new objects, these new objects are going to go into that layer. Now, if we click this button, the Layer Explorer, but you can also see the same thing up here in the main toolbar, we click this, it came up to my other window. You're going to see the Scene Explorer that lists all the layers, and we can have them nested, and it will show you all the objects that are in these different layers. So right now these objects, this box 15 and 16 are currently in that layer. If we click this hide button here, everything in that layer hides. You can see the default, which is what we were making things earlier into, are here. So I can, through this Scene Explorer, either hide and unhide individual things if I want to, or I can hide and unhide the entire layer. So this is the equivalent to viz groups. To create new viz groups, you can either use the layer toolbar, or you can also use these buttons at the top of the Scene Explorer. Now there are some other options for selecting multiple objects. So, obviously we can select, several objects in here by control clicking and selecting them all in here. We can also select this layer by right-clicking it and hitting select child nodes, and then it selects everything in that layer. So the viz groups allow you to manage not only the display, but also for selecting things. And we're going to go into discussing another way to manage different groups of objects, but it's not really with the Scene Explorer directly. These are called name selection sets. So we can imagine that this section of this scene here represents a certain area in my level, and we might call this the southwest room, or anything we want to call it. What we can do is select these objects and just type up here southwest and hit enter. When I do that, this becomes a named selection set. So now if I go over here and I select this object because I want to do whatever I need to do, and then I say, oh no, I need to select those objects again, I can just find that and select them again with this drop down. If I forgot to add something to that name selection set, I can go in here to the Manage Selection Sets, see all the objects that are in it, I can select something, and then hit this button Add, and it adds whatever I currently have selected. So now that object is now part of this name selection set. So we can create another selection set. We're going to call this one Center Room, just because. And now you can see that we can select by center room, southwest corner, center room. And you can see if we go into the Scene Explorer here, that the objects are switching their selection as we go to these back and forth. I can also in here have it show me in this Layer Explorer anything by the select in here by the selection sets. So while I'm in my Scene Explorer. So understanding how the name selection sets and Scene Explorer works will help you manage your scene and find the things you're looking for more easily. There are other options for hiding and showing types of objects, and we're going to go over here to the command panel now and discuss that. We've already discussed the Create tab, the Modify tab. We're not going to discuss Hierarchy for now, or Motion, but we are going to go to Display. If we click there, we can actually hide objects in the scene based off of what kind of object they are. So right now, everything in here that we've made so far is actually geometry. So if I click this Hide by Geometry, all geometry will be hidden. Uncheck that and it will let us see geometry again. That might be useful if you have different types of objects in your scene. For example, shapes. So in this case, we might have a shape where we just drew some lines. Or we might have lights. And if we go to the display, if we don't want to see our lights while we're working right now, we can click this and it will automatically hide them. Same with shapes. They're still there, but we can't see them in the viewport. So this is under the Display tab. This will help you show and hide things along with the Layer Manager. So the next and final thing I'm going to discuss in this video is the vertex manipulation tool and the clipping tool. I will go into the material and decals in the next video. So in Hammer, if we want to manipulate an object by its vertices, we go to this clipping tool or the vertex editor. We select the vertices we want to change and we move them around in one of the views. And select the pick tool to finish what we've done here to manipulate it. Likewise, if we want to clip something, we select it, and in our viewport we click and drag a line that represents the clipping of it. And if you click on the clipping tool, you'll change between different modes of slicing it in the middle into separate objects or actually removing one side or the other. And once we have it where we want, we just hit enter and it will finish the function. So those are the two things we're going to discuss now in Max. I'm going to maximize Max here. And if we go back to our objects here and go to the Modify tab, you see we have our parameters again, but we have no control over the specific vertices, the edges, etc. This brings us to the next concept in 3ds Max. We have primitives, and then we have other types of geometry and tools for modifying the geometry. So we're going to start by just using a tool for modifying, and we're going to use the modifier list. So when we're in the Modify tab, you're going to see that there's this drop down here that says Modify List. If we click on this, it's going to show you this long list of functions. These are all modifiers. What we're going to choose to begin with here is Slice. Now when we add this, you're going to see our box is still here in the list, and above it is the Slice modifier. You're also going to see a bunch of parameters down here. Now by default, you will only see these up here. If you have Wallworm installed, you'll see all of these extra functions. Wallworm adds a bunch of these to this modifier. We have split mesh, remove top, and remove bottom. These are very similar to the options in the clipping tool in Hammer. So if I hit remove top, it's all going to disappear here because of where our slice plane is. We're going to choose back to split mesh for the moment. Notice when we have this modifier added, there's a little arrow here. Not all modifiers will have this, but some will. This means that this modifier has what is called a sub-object. If I open that, you see there's this thing called a slice plane. I'm going to select that, and to make this easier for what I'm doing, I'm going to turn off snaps. And just to show you this right now, you really do want to use snaps a lot with brushes, but for the moment I'm going to just show you to make it smooth. You can see that I'm able to change where this slice is happening. So now if I hit remove bottom, you're going to see that the bottom of this is changing based off of where the slice is at. In fact, I can rotate this and it's changing all of that. Similar to using the slice plane that we saw in Hammer to change the angles. If you have Wallworm installed, we can actually have this automatically aligned to certain faces. We can just, right now if we want this slice plane to be aligned to that top surface, I can click Align to Face, pick that face, and now the slice plane will be aligned in the world to that specific face. Or if I wanted to align it to this face instead, you can see that it's now aligned there, and we're slicing the side of it. Now notice the back side of this object is open now. That is because when we did this remove bottom, it did not add and seal this object. We can solve this by adding another modifier. We're going to choose cap holes. So now you're going to see we have this cap holes modifier, the slice modifier, and our original box. Depending on the type of modifier you have, you can still go back down. So for example, I can still now go back down to my slice, and if I wanted to, I can go to the slice plane itself and change where it's slicing from. Likewise, I can still go back down to the box level and say that this box still needs to be taller. or shorter, depending on my needs. This video is not going to cover all of the modifiers that are in Max. There are many, and you can add new modifiers by buying them or installing them, getting some from Wallworm. We're not going to discuss all of those. But there is one important modifier called Brushify. If we add this to an object, we can automatically make all of the vertices snap to the grid. And that's all we're going to discuss about this modifier at the moment. But by adding this, it means that even if I had sliced this not on the grid, all of the vertices would still end up on the grid. Now we're going to talk about the clipping and vertex manipulation in another scenario. This time let's select this object over here. And to make things easier to see and view, I'm going to introduce you to another function here, this isolate selection, also Alt-Q. If you select that, it will temporarily hide everything except for what you currently have selected. Now we're going to work with a different type of geometry. Right now we had worked with primitives, boxes, and cylinders and spheres, but sometimes you want to have more control over your objects and you don't want to use modifiers. You might want to do it by specifically manipulating the vertices or edges. What we're going to do is turn this into a type of object called Editable Poly. There are different ways to do this. One way is to right-click your object in the viewport, go down to Convert To, and choose Editable Poly. For the most part, this should be the type of geometry you collapse to when you're collapsing to a mesh. There is one called Editable Mesh. It does not have as many editing tools as Editable Poly. So this should always be your default type of object. And Editable Patch and NURBS, these are not the type of objects you should create for the most part, especially with working with brushes. So we're going to convert this to an Editable Poly. And now notice that the Modify tab has changed. We don't have a height, width, and length. We don't have the segments to control. Instead, we have a whole bunch of rollouts here in the Modifier tab, and you'll see that we have all of these buttons here, and these are the sub objects of this object. Notice also up above, similarly to how the modifier was for slice plane, for the slice modifier, there's this little arrow. If we click that, we're going to see vertex, edge, border, polygon, and element, which relates to these different types of sub-objects, these icons down here. And notice when you select one, you're going to see that it's highlighted up here, and it has the icon that designates what kind of object, what kind of sub-object you're working on. And as you can guess, when you go to vertex mode, that means you can manipulate just that vertex. Now, I'm going to undo this. Just like in Hammer, where you have to be careful about moving these vertices around, if this is a brush, if this is going to be world geometry for your level, you have to be very careful. If this is a model we're going to compile into the game, then you don't have to worry so much about the rules of brushes. Brushes must always be convex, and they should have no coplanar polygons. Also, every polygon needs to be convex. So we're going to explain what that means here. Notice that when I start bending this down, there's a polygon on the top. This is the equivalent of a brush side. This is no longer valid because that polygon is not planar. So all the polygons need to be planar, and we can't have coplanar ones. So we can solve that in a few ways. If we needed to push this down and we wanted it to be like that, we could select these two vertices at the top and connect them, effectively converting that one polygon into two polygons. However, I'm going to undo both of those actions. If I just wanted to move this up, I could select those two vertices. I'm going to change my selection mode here to... So I select those two vertices. Now we can move them up and down as we want here. And because of this, the way this geometry is, just like in Hammer, we're just moving those vertices up. We're manipulating just those vertices, and this is now still a valid brush. Instead of selecting those two vertices, I could have selected this edge instead, and it would be doing the same exact thing. You can select by polygon. So if we select here and move up, and this is by element. And we'll discuss this more in another video, the element mode. Border mode should not be able to select anything if you have a brush, because brushes should always be sealed. So there are no borders. However, to see what it would be is if I deleted this polygon. Now if I selected, I can choose that border because those are open edges that have no polygons there. If I need to fill this open border because I had accidentally deleted faces or I was generating this and this is where it got to, while I'm in this, I can select that border and just hit cap, and it will seal that up. Now, an important aspect of editing geometry is understanding how your edits will affect the UVs, and the UVs are how the textures are applied to your object. But we're not going to go into that in this video because we're going to go into the textures and working with the textures and the UVs in the next video. But there is something I do want to point out is if you have a brush and you've already got the materials on it, there's an option here that says preserve UVs. You might want to check this when you're sliding your sub-objects around. Just an important thing to be aware of. So in the Editable Poly, you're going to see that the options available over here on the right-hand side are dependent on which sub-object that you have. Notice this Edit Polygons, what options are available here changes if we go to vertex level. So suddenly we have different functions that we can perform. Notice that when we go back and forth between the different modes, it's going to remember your current sub-object selection. So right now let's select, we've got these two vertices selected right here. If we go back to the polygon mode, it remembered the last selection that we were on. If we go to vertex mode, it remembered the last selection we were on with those. And just like with objects that we had created name selection sets earlier, sub-objects can also have name selection sets. So I can name these two currently selected vertices my favorites, and I can name these two disappointments. And I can now use this name selection set to get back to those selected objects. Disappointments. And these are based on the sub-object level. So if I go to the polygon level, you're going to see that there is nothing. But I can name this guy if I want to, top. And I can hit Control-I to change my selection, to invert the current selection. I'm going to change this to bottom. All, hit enter. So now you can see that I can quickly jump back and forth between these. One caveat, if you change the topology of this object by adding new faces or vertices, you invalidate your name selection sets. So it's something to be aware of. But anyway, if we go back to vertex sub-object mode, I still have those, and you can see I can go to my favorites instead, or vice versa. That's going to end this first introductory video comparing Max and Hammer. In the next video, I will discuss some of the material and texture applications and decals, displacements, and some other functions in Wallworm, like adding entities, etc., and then getting your level into the game. My name is Sean Olson. I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it educational. You can learn more about me at my website, seanolson.net, and you can always get the latest version of Wallworm and other Wallworm tools at wallworm.com. Thank you and have a good day.